To you, it must seem long ago, the time before your embarkation, before you journeyed through the matter fields to surface on this world. But to us the hour is early still, and much will change before our morning has passed. You left us with instructions to bring you this record when the dawn was full. Come gather around this conscious fire, peoples of the earth, and listen to the spirits of the stars. We would tell you of the early hours when your thoughts first came to rest upon this world, when your love first illumined the world and shone through robes of water and soil, days when we were with you yet, back when the world was young. Eons ago, before there was physical matter, you were one with us. Your essence remains, even now, indistinguishable from the unified field of being, out of which flow duality, multiplicity, and all that flourishes in the eternal play of polarities. In oneness with the eternal source, in flowing, fluid realms of all spectrum light and love, we lived together in the early ages of the morning. Together we shared a common I. As waves of energy, we flowed through fields of dreams, the landscape of our eternal home. There was a game we would sometimes play, an elementary energy exchange, an early form of relationship. A segment of source energy would break itself free from the main body and assume momentary individuality, personifying selected frequencies in order to experience relationships with others who had done the same. From the realm of eternal unity we chose frequencies, hues, and rates of vibration. Like crystals of snow forming in a stratospheric cloud, we personified them in the field of our common being. Our locations created space, our movements, time. The first personification of the Eternal One brought forth the second personification and instantaneously the third. For the very thought of coalescing consciousness into an other immediately evoked a definition of one that was not one alone, but rather one including other. In the language of light, our word for other has no singular form, while both one and infinity are represented by the same word. The Trinity we know as our source is not three beings alone, but three beings including within them all beings. Its second and third persons contain the two primary divisions that include all creation. Its first person embraces the two, and all that they contain, extending far beyond their dimensional worlds, so far beyond, it cannot be conveyed in human terms. The biases of human languages imply that there was a linear sequence to the unfoldment of the One, through Trinity into multiplicity, but in reality, this occurrence was, and is, as instantaneous as a thought intrinsic in the very nature of being, a thought that takes no time to appear. A thought, therefore, that has appeared many times before. Throughout eternity, this thought comes into being again and again. While it is sustained, time also comes into being. When it is no longer animated, time ceases. The creation of specific beings or angels, to sustain this thought over an open-ended stretch of time, brought forth the steady stream of cumulative creation that has made possible, and given birth to, this present universe. Though there is no linear sequence to the unfoldment of the One into the Trinity, and indeed, no linear sequence to the unfoldment of the eternal being into cherubim and seraphim, thrones, principalities, and multiple personifications of eternal spirit. A linear sequence of events did occur in the spirit world prior to the first physical manifestations of light, sound, and matter. As a fetus experiences a gestation in the invisible realms before entering the stage of the visible world, so, too, do light, sound, galaxies, and all that they contain. Only after experiencing a cycle of development on the finer, more subtle frequencies of being, filling those realms to the full, do they spill over into physical objectification. In much the same way there was an invisible sequence of cause and effect that preceded your tumble into visible history. To rise again to your native levels of understanding, you must in a certain sense reverse that process. You can reverse the process without conscious understanding. A child's trust in the inherent benevolence of life is all that is required. However, given your historical tendency to gravitate toward behavior based upon conceptual knowledge, it would be well for you to have at least some understanding of the decision that led you to inhabit the image worlds of these semi-conscious primates. If you are blessed with a child's trust and your mind does not trouble you with questions of how you came today to be so biologically clothed, move on to the chapters that follow this. Yet if a day comes when your mind needs to be calmed with a reminder of what it has not forgotten in its depths, know that a reminder is here for you, in this account. If at any point in this narrative your spirit wants to fly more quickly than these words, move on. These words are offered to free you, to lift you. Skip over passages that may appear too detailed. They are for another time, if you need them, and only if you do. The weather is not the same today and tomorrow, and neither is the weather that keeps your conscious thought alive. On stormy days more detail will help you navigate through. You may then need these thoughts to fix your compass by. On days of sun and wind and open sea, the words you need to guide you are few. Take what thought you need today, but take no thought for tomorrow. Tomorrow you will not be the same. This much is sure. These transmissions are designed to give you conceptual tools for those times you may need them, tools of insight, to enhance your creative capacity and your enjoyment of the physical plane, tools that will reduce the likelihood of your sliding yet again into the sleep that has characterized this recent age. To understand your fall into the troubled times of history, you must first recall the context in which it occurred. The fall from awareness. Scattered throughout the sea of eternal being are distinct locations that radiate specific qualities. These qualities permeate the entire sea of creation, rippling throughout all that is, but the source locations from which they radiate are in either one of two constellations. These two constellations, love and truth, are two polarities of eternal being, two persons of the Trinity. They engender all that is. Their interplay evokes the universe and all the wonders it contains. The constellation of love is the home of qualities associated with energy expression, and the constellation of truth is the home of qualities associated with form and structure. These two polarities overlap and interplay, neither is devoid of qualities originating in the other. The radiations of each quality permeate the entirety of both constellations, but the source from which each quality radiates is located in one constellation or the other. Within this interplay, between a constellation of qualities rooted in truth, and a constellation of qualities rooted in love, individual spirit beings come into existence. It is within this context that your current cycle of individuality began. Each spirit being forms around specific frequency radiations of eternal qualities, consciously personifying them. Each individual spirit coalesces within the creative field that is generated by the interacting radiations of love and truth, and all things from the galaxies to the microbes are manifestations of these spirit beings. Through them the universe comes into form. There is no star in existence without a being who has chosen to appear as that star, nor is there any planet, asteroid, sun, or moon, no leaf, no insect, no flower, no tree, no tiny ocean snail, no grain of sand on the beach, that does not form around a spirit life. When the first spirit beings, personifications of various qualities of awareness, would individualize and distinguish themselves from the main body of awareness, to experience relationships with others who had done the same, they would after each relationship dissolve back again into the unity out of which they came. This process of individuation, spirit sleeping dolphin-like from the sea of eternal unity into the air of individuality, then disappearing again beneath the waves of undifferentiated oneness, was purely for enjoyment. The first entities in the sea of being had no stake, no vested interest in their passing individual forms. One day, as you were individualizing certain qualities of eternal awareness, just emerging from a relationship, another entity of individualized awareness came to you and encouraged you to retain your present form of individuality, and to carry that form over into a new relationship. This was a new thought. It had never before occurred to you to experience multiple relationships without a renewal of identity. You did not accept the idea immediately, but you did consider it. As you continued to listen, you mulled over its strange and fascinating possibilities. The curious being promoting this novelty appeared in a pulsing field of vibratory luminosity, infinitely more beautiful and well-defined than any you had ever seen. One of the attractive elements in this entity's proposal was that this path would, over time, allow the formation of the same sort of beautiful and intricate patterns within your own individualized field. But there was a dark side as well. Something else the entity said. You were not entirely certain of its accuracy. At first you saw only humor in what seemed the absurdity of the thought. Yet as you considered it, you wondered if there might not be something to it. It took time and further argument, but eventually you were convinced by this entity that there was a possibility, perhaps even a strong one, that you might actually cease to exist if you did not follow this recommended course, consciously preserving your individuality from one relationship to the next. After all, you did not know exactly what happened to individuals who dissolved back into the sea. This is the first lie that you believed. The form of your individuality would, of course, cease to exist if your awareness were no longer focused through it, just as the focus of light through a lens ceases to exist when the light is turned in another direction. Yet the potential for your individuality would remain, just as the lens itself remains, should you again choose to turn your attention toward it. It would not disappear. Potential can be either actualized or ignored, but it cannot be created or destroyed. All potential exists from the beginning and is eternal, as is the one whose being contains and sustains it. You are listening to these words at this moment through an individualized focus of your awareness, but you do not cease to exist with the cessation of that individuality. The awareness that shines through your lens of individuality is the awareness that shines through all lenses of individuality. You are the being behind all individuals, the awareness within and beyond all these things. You know this in spirit. To know this while in individual form is to be conscious. To imagine that you are the focus of individuality itself, to imagine that you are the form and not the spirit that animates it, is to be subconscious. When any personification of eternal awareness, your own essential awareness, comes into a relationship with any other, it flows into a form of self-identity that will optimize creativity and enjoyment during the relationship. Just as an environment shapes and molds the plants that flourish within it, relationships mold the forms of identity for all healthy spirit beings. Since relationships are ever-changing, healthy identities are ever-changing as well, flowing from moment to moment, assuming the forms most suited to creative exchange. In a healthy state, continuity of identity occurs on the level of spirit, not on the level of form. Your fall from awareness of your eternal nature into the illusion of separation was not a single event. It was a gradual and, at first, a very subtle process. It began when you chose to retain a specific form of identity, after the experience that had molded that identity had passed. Choosing to bring a past-centered identity into a present experience reduced your sensitivity to the influences of the new moment. The new relationship could no longer guide your sense of self into identity patterns conducive to optimal interaction. Consequently, as you will see more clearly as our account progresses, your very presence was reduced along with the clarity of your perception. You quickly found that an identity based on memory of the past had to be consciously sustained. Unlike natural, healthy identities, which formed and dissolved without conscious effort, an arbitrary, past-oriented sense of self required maintenance. You began to take yourself more seriously. You began to think of yourself more as the external form of expression, and less as the spirit behind expression. You began to give your individual identity greater importance than was its due. You overlooked something vital. You forgot that you have the ability to individualize the quality of self, perfect for each occasion. Overriding the natural process through which your sense of self spontaneously flows into organic expression, your presence, though in reality still coming from the eternal source, was no longer a clear extension of that source. Yet this was very subtle at first, merely a slight off-center shift of emphasis. After a time of many relationships upon the higher frequencies of the spirit world, you traveled with the others of your light circle toward the central region of the constellation of truth, the region known as the fields of structure. You entered the awesome and wonderful realms where the processes of materialization were occurring. In the fields of structure, the thoughts in which you conceived yourself gradually began to draw to them the tiny crystallized particles that blew up from the region of stars far below. Many of us have gone through this materialization process consciously, identifying with matter, only when we chose, keeping our original sense of spirit self intact, remaining integral, whole, holy, connected with the Great Spirit, acquiring material clothing, for purposes of creation and enjoyment, but never forgetting ourselves, never confusing the wearer of the robe with the fabric of the robe. But your habits of identity were such that this was not your experience. As particles of matter were drawn to your biogravitational thought fields, you began identifying with what was becoming an increasingly tangible form. As they were gradually clothed in successive layers of molecular structure, you began to see the thoughts of individuality that you had chosen to hold beyond their time. You were fascinated. They were very beautiful. Within the luminous field of energy that distinguished the focus of your attention, a body began to take shape. The first particles that gave it form were extremely fine and subtle, smaller than the finest molecules. You identified with the swirling patterns they formed within your energy field, these early forerunners of cells and organs. Until this point, your central motivation had always been love. It is true that it had been qualified from time to time by a sense of curiosity that was not always in your best interests, but there was an innocence about it, and certainly no selfish or fearful intent. Even as your etheric body formed within you, your motivation remained primarily centered in love. But as you played around the edges of the fields of structure, and identified with ever more tangible and beautiful sheaths of shimmering individuality, you would occasionally entertain in your consciousness a whispering of doubt, a whispering so effervescent, so subtle, so much at the periphery of your thoughts that you hardly noticed it at first. "I am supported by this sea," whispered the doubt, "this sea of universal being. But what if someday it is no longer here? Will its support always continue? Will it sustain my awareness forever? Does it care for my individuality? For these beautiful forms and patterns that my thoughts are creating within me? These patterns are what make me unique. I have been watching them for so long, I am not entirely sure anymore what I would be without them. What if this sea of being, great and benevolent though it is, were to dislike my growing sheath of tangibility? What if a time comes when the sea is gone and I find myself alone?" As time passed, this whispering became so familiar that you assumed such thoughts were your own. Already confusing your sense of self with the thought formations that swirled within your awareness, you now began to feel protective toward those formations, to feel anxiety for them, and for yourself. So it was that you entered the astral realms, identifying not only with prior thought and experience but also with emotional energy patterns that did not always originate in the pure currents of perfect love. The knowledge that the others of your light circle were focalizations of the same awareness you knew as your own, gradually began to fade. For the first time, you began to perceive others who did not seem to have emerged from your own root being. Actually, these others are beings just like yourself. Some would complete their courses and return in time to the field of unity, but others were gathering layers of experience, without the natural relinquishing of form that characterizes and renews all healthy identities. Like you, they soon found that tension was required to hold on to their images and memories. They also found it increasingly difficult to distinguish these past impressions from their sense of self. They lost contact with the creative currents of renewal that are designed to recharge periodically all aware creatures, keeping them clear-sighted, alert, and in communion with the Source. Simultaneously, these entities, and there were many of them by now, found themselves growing bodies of increasingly dense form. Meanwhile, there were others of us in these fields of dreams who watched this behavior from afar. We saw many of the playful, happy beings whom we knew as our companions and friends, one by one, becoming dull, serious, and afraid. It seemed to us that a branch of our family had been infected with some strangely debilitating perceptual disorder. We attempted to communicate telepathically with them as we did with one another, but we found that we did not understand the strangely biased dialects of their now significantly altered thought processes. They thought our inability to communicate with them was due to our ignorance. Eventually they lost interest in what they came to regard as the ethereal opinions of insubstantial entities. Yet we could see growing disease and unhappiness recorded ever more graphically in their developing bodies. We saw clearly what they could no longer see themselves, the inevitable danger that awaited them if they continued to follow such ever-narrowing identity beams, all the way to their inevitable conclusion. Among those of us who wanted to offer assistance were some who realized that we could only speak to them in their own terms, through material forms similar enough to their own, to elicit their notice and respect. These beings, angels of principality, or bodhisattvas, as they are called in some traditions, decided to embark on a course of conscious materialization. We watched them enter the fields of structure and spiral downward, only to see appearing in many of them too, the darkening of luminosity and crystallization of imagery that characterized those whom they had hoped to help. Yet despite the contagious nature of the disorder, a few among the principalities escaped contamination. These few proceeded all the way down the whirlpool-like energy vortex of gathering structure, with a unified sense of identity still prevailing in their awareness. We watched them spiral around and around, side by side with the others, circling ever downward through increasingly lower frequencies, accumulating more tangible material dress with the deepening levels of their descent. It was a race of sorts, the conscious principalities attempting to beat the fearful to materialization upon the physical plane. The conscious principalities arrived first. In a forest-covered river valley, upon this very earth, at the edge of a fertile plain, they took on the luminous garments of the first human biology. Though their uncontested stewardship of this region of the earth was brief by eternal standards, it was nevertheless sufficient to see the Creator's intentions flow through human form, into the creation of exquisite fruit, vegetation, and animal species. From this time, have arisen the human myths and legends, or paradise. As the legends also recall, this era was not to last. All too soon, it seemed, the dark principalities arrived, angry at the disease they had acquired, and at those in whom it had originated. Shortly after them arrived the many entities like yourself. Not long after your arrival on the physical plane, you began to think of yourself as separate beings, cut off, distinct from your source. You developed a strange habit of storing identities within your psyche, as one might store dresses or suits of clothing in a closet. preserving them with herbs of self-importance and spices of fear. Your overall awareness was still predominantly centered in the currents of love. You were certainly not evil at this point. For many centuries you continued to share the same equatorial region of the earth, both with the fallen principalities, and with principalities who had not lost their eternal awareness, all of you in human form. You knew times of great joy and happiness, as well as times of doubt and confusion. Yet with each additional passage of the moon, the implications of your over-identification with form appeared more and more forcefully. Around you,